Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 433. And this time, I'm going to talk about this record which came out on Columbia in 1956 by the Jazz Messengers called The Jazz Messengers. My copy is a first mono pressing on Columbia. Now, the Messengers were probably most closely associated with Blue Note over the course of their history, but they recorded with many different labels. And this record is one of just two records that the Jazz Messengers made with Columbia in their entire 36-year history in the studio. It's also produced by George Avakian at Columbia Studios. As some of the band's best-known recordings were done with Rudy Van Gelder, as were a number of the recordings of the band's alumni on Blue Note, it's fascinating to note the difference in sound which results from them being in something other than their usual setting. Overall, this is a fascinating record, and some might say, even though this is a controversial statement, this might be the best Jazz Messengers record. The Jazz Messengers are an institution of American music, and despite an endlessly rotating lineup, the leader and drummer, Art Blakey, was the only constant member, they remained a consistent, observable thing for 36 years, and there are a number of reasons for this. I think we have to note first that Blakey's insistence on keeping the name Jazz Messengers long after all his co-founders had left, I think has to do with his realization that that name had quickly become associated with the pulsating, virtuosic music that became known as hard bop. And he, I think, was astute enough to realize that that name was a better brand than his own. Another reason for the longevity of the Jazz Messengers as an entity was Blakey's talent spotting. People he recruited over the years included Clifford Brown, Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, Donald Byrd, Kenny Dorham, Wayne Shorter, and Freddie Hubbard. And once Blakey's pipeline of talent had been established and the subsequent careers of the band's alumni well known, the Messengers became a much desired way station for up-and-coming jazz musicians. And that meant that Blakey could afford to let his stars leave when they wanted to leave because he knew he could replace them. There are, however, other less savory reasons for the regular rotation of the group. Early members of Blakey's groups, like Clifford Brown, like Doug Watkins, and like Horace Silver, ended up leaving pretty soon because of the culture of heroin use by Blakey and by other band members. Blakey was also accused, some would say unfairly, of using his band members' heroin use to exploit them. Whatever all these reasons, the band was a long-standing band, but it was also a revolving door. There was an early recording date, kind of a proto-version of the band, that included Clifford Brown, Lou Donaldson, and Curly Russell. That band broke up, and the first accepted version of the Jazz Messengers was a different lineup, which included Hank Mobley on tenor, Doug Watkins on bass, and Kenny Dorham on trumpet, as well as Silver and Blakey. That version of the band made several records for Blue Note from 1954 until 1955, including those two famous live dates at the Café Bohemia. But right after those dates, in November 1955, Kenny Dorham leaves. Blakey quickly had a replacement lineup. A young Donald Byrd came in on trumpet. He had come from that amazing jazz production line in Detroit, Cass Tech High School, and then Wayne State University's music program, via a detour in the Air Force. Once he arrived in New York, Byrd's first regular gig was with the piano player George Wallington, and he appears on Wallington's record also made live at the Café Bohemia. But soon after, in the fall of 1955, he was poached by Blakey. The Jazz Messengers, as I mentioned, had typically been recording for Blue Note, but the first record they actually make with the Donald Byrd version of the band is actually for Tom Wilson's Transition Records. In the summer of 1955, Wilson had gone to Detroit, acting on a tip from Cannonball Adderley, to go and check out this young trumpet player, Donald Byrd. He actually meets Byrd and Byrd's father, who was a minister, and he asks permission to sign Byrd to a contract. The following month, Byrd goes into the studio and he makes Byrd Jazz for Transition. He then joins the Jazz Messengers, but he still owes Tom Wilson a couple of records. So in December 1955, the Jazz Messengers, together with the trumpeter Joe Gordon, and with Donald Byrd newly in their ranks, go into the studio to make this record for Transition, Bird's Eye View, which has since had the all-analog glossy cover treatment. At this point in the story, entered George Avakian. He's a hugely important figure as an A&R man and a producer, and he plays key roles for Decca, Columbia, Pacific Jazz, Warner Brothers, and RCA during the mid-century primacy of jazz. If you watched my recently uploaded video on jazz on Columbia Records, you'll know that Avakian was a committed jazz fan who found himself in the mid-1950s at a label, Columbia, where he was trying to bring in high-quality jazz, and the suits upstairs were really more interested in much lighter, more commercial fare. So his challenge to satisfy his boss, Mitch Miller, was to come up with artists who were not only artistically pleasing, but were also going to shift product. At this point in the winter of 1955-56, Avakian was in the midst of recording a record by the Dutch jazz singer Reys, which was being done over several different recording sessions. And the tracks on side 2 of that record on Columbia, the cool voice of Reys, were all done with the Jazz Messengers as sidemen. Avakian knew of the Messengers because of the big noise they'd been making in New York over the previous 2 years, and during these sessions he actively courted them to record for Columbia on their own. And eventually, Blakey and the rest of the band agreed that the Jazz Messengers' next record would be on Columbia, and that is how this record comes to be made in the spring of 1956. It's a fascinating document for reasons I'll get into shortly, but it's also Donald Byrd's swan song on vinyl with the Jazz Messengers. He stayed in the group for just a few months longer, although the revolving door was starting to speed up. Mobley, Silver, and Watkins all left that spring, and pretty soon Donald Byrd was on his way too. This record is made on April 6th and May 4th, 1956, at Columbia Studios on 30th Street in Manhattan. The producer is George Avakian, and although uncredited on the record, the recording engineer is almost certainly Frank Lako, who was the house engineer at that studio for a number of years. And I think that makes a huge difference. I'm very used to, as maybe some of you are as well, at listening to Jazz Messengers and Horace Silver and Art Blakey records on Blue Note. They have a very punchy sound, which was very appealing on the hi-fi systems of the day, but I also find them to be quite compressed. I think they're cut quite hot, and of course there's also the issue of how poorly Rudy Van Gelder recorded the piano. This record, by contrast, is a revelation. The production is airy and spacious. There's some very pleasing fine detail in the music, particularly in Blakey's drum work, and the piano, as a bonus, sounds terrific. It's also interesting to note, because we're now in 1956, and record producers and musicians are starting to realize the potential of the 12-inch record, that gone are the days of the 4-minute song. We have, I think, only one song which is less than 5.5 minutes on here, and the longest track, Nika's Dream, is almost 12 minutes long. The photography in the cover is by Columbia's house photographer, Don Hunstein. The photographs he chose are, I guess, a bit idiosyncratic. I kind of get what he was going for, but I don't think over at Blue Note, Reed Miles and Frank Wolf would have felt under threat when they saw this cover. Also, if you had any doubt that Mobley was about to leave the band, that doubt should be dispelled by this picture. Side 1 starts with Infra Ray, and I'm struck right away when I listen to this by Donald Byrd's confident chops. When Silver's piano comes into focus, it's remarkable to hear him recorded by somebody other than Van Gelder, and Blakey's drumming too in this track is fascinating, particularly underneath Mobley's solo. Then we come to the centerpiece of the record, Nika's Dream, all 11 minutes and 51 seconds of it. This, I think, is very clearly superior to the version that Horace records himself on Horoscope a number of years later on Blue Note. The final track on side 1 is a standard. It's You or No One. This is another superb, locked-in performance with stellar turns from both Byrd and Mobley. Side 2 starts with Echaro by Horace Silver. This is an entirely typical Silver tune. It's got an appealing melody, a swinging, percussive piano line, and Silver subtly bringing out the best in the other soloists. Then we have the second of 3 compositions by Mobley, Carol's Interlude. Mobley starts his solo, I think, in a little bit of a gingerly manner, but he soon warms up, and Byrd is in top form. The End of a Love Affair is a gloriously swinging mid-tempo number. And as for Hank's Symphony, the closer, which is the last track by Mobley, the theme is perhaps a little bit stodgy, but the main reason to listen to this track is for the absolutely barnstorming solo by Blakey. It's unmissable. I will confess to overlooking this record for many years in my own collection. I bought it a number of years ago, but when it came time to put something on the turntable, I often passed over it in favor of Jazz Messengers or Horace Silver Blue Note releases. No longer. I can't think of a record that either Blakey or Silver made together or as individual leaders in the later 1950s that surpasses the music on this record. The talent on here is overflowing, and that original version of Nika's Dream is reason alone to pick this record up. It also sounds amazing, in a lot of ways better than Blue Note recordings of the same artists from around the same time. And best of all, if you're looking for an original 6-eye pressing of this, it's going to cost you about half of what an equivalent early Blue Note first pressing is going to cost you from the same era. This record gets my wholehearted endorsement, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.